Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. Today we are learning Samach Zayin Amud Beis. We're middle of Hilchos Pesach. We're in Siman Tuf Samach Vav, and we're picking up today on the first line of Samach Zayin Amud Beis with Sif Dalid in the Mechaber. So it's Siman Tuf Samach Vav Sif Dalid. Says the Mechaber, Naflu Mayim al Kemach. If water fell onto flour, Oin Nislachlach Hasak. Or you had a sack of flour, and you now find that the sack is damp. The sack has gotten wet. What should you do? Is there a way to salvage some of this flour to be able to use some of this flour? Says the Mechaber. I see just one of the cameras over here just started, so I'm just going to read the words of the Mechaber again. Siman Tav Samach Vav Siv Dalad Samach Zayin Bebeis Naflu Mayim al Kemach. If water fell on flour and Nislachlach Hasak, or you have a sack of flour and you now discover that the sack is damp, some water obviously has fallen onto this sack of flour, what can you do to salvage the flour? Says the Mechaber, Yoichaz biyodai, you should grasp in your hand, Kol hamokaim hamaluchlach basak, the part of the sack that is damp. Go ahead and grasp that area of the sack in your hand. And as the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain, what the Mechaber means here is not only that you grab the sack, but you grab the sack and you grasp in your hand through the fabric of the sack that area of the flour as well. And then ad sheyorik kala kemach shabasak, and then pour out the rest of the flour from the sack. So what you're attempting to do over here is you see a damp area on the sack. So take your hand and bunch up the fabric of the sack, grab it in your hand, close your hand around it as much as you can, and try to get that whole damp area and the flour that got damp and a little bit of the flour around the flour that got damp. And while you're holding that, pour out the rest of the flour from the sack. And what you're attempting to do is remove all of the flour that had gotten damp while holding on to the flour and you're holding that in your hand while you're emptying out all of the dry flour, which will be able to be used. I will discuss this in greater detail in the Mishnah Berurah. And the Mechaber continues, V'im iav shalasos came. Let's say it's not possible to do this. And the Berurah, a nice cut and test, explains why very succinctly. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say it as well, but the Berurah encapsulates it in just several words. Let's say you look at this sack and you see that the sack has become moistened or damp in a whole bunch of different areas. So you have no way of holding on to all of these areas while you empty out the rest of the sack. So the Mechaber gives you another possible eitzah, another possible way that you may be able to salvage the rest of the flour. Says the Mechaber, if you cannot do this, what should you do? Then take the flour and sift the flour. And the hope over here is that you're going to sift the flour. The parts of the flour that got damp, we know that when flour gets wet, it forms clumps, right? Like this flour is very fine, but once it gets damp, so the little tiny grains of flour, they stick together and they form clumps. So if you'll sift the flour, you'll sift out the moistened clumps of flour, and you'll get through the sieve only the dry flour. The hashar mutter, and the rest is okay. Now, I'm going to jump. It's very rare that we do this, but I'm going to jump straight from the Mechaber, straight into the Bir Halacha. I just want to show you a Bir Halacha here. If you take a look at the Bir Halacha, Dibur HaMaschil, V'im I Efsher. So the Mechaber gave us over here two ways to approach this problem. The first one was grab the sack and try to hold the moistened flour of that area in your hand together with the fabric of the sack. Empty out the sack while you're holding the moistened area, and whatever you pour out of the sack you could use, and whatever was caught in your hand together with the fabric of the sack, that you're going to get rid of, because that's the part that got wet. That was eitzah number one. Eitzah number two was, if you cannot do that, then you could sift the flour and sift out the clumps of moistened flour. Now, can you do that lechatchila? Could you do the second eitzah, sift the flour instead of the first flour? So says the Bir Halacha over here, Chavetz Chaim says this idea that you could sift the flour and salvage the rest of the flour in that way, who's svaras harekeach? This comes from a rekeach. The Rosh takes great issue with this rekeach. The Rosh says that you can't do that. This is not effective, because how do you know you're going to sift out everything? We know that chametz is also b'mashu, and you're hoping that you got everything that got moistened. Maybe you didn't. Or maybe there was an area that had gotten moistened that already dried up, and because it dried up, it's already fine again, and it's going through the sieve. So the Rosh doesn't like this idea. Nevertheless, samach aleha hamechaber. The mechaber was willing to rely on the svara of the rekeach to render permissible the rest of the flour in a case where it's efshir, where it's impossible for you to use the Rosh's eitzah of holding on to the sack and grabbing the moistened flour. Then if you cannot do that, you could rely on the rekeach. Mishum degas become das haMordechai kisvarazu, because he found the Mordechai that also agrees with this idea of the rekeach. Rak, however, we're going to see later on in this sif, benis yavesh, in a case where we know that the flour had gotten moistened and already dried up. Shaladas haMordechai gamken lahachmir kar Rosh. In that case, the Mordechai also is machmir like the Rosh, and he says he doesn't like the idea of sifting the flour. Over there, we're going to see that when the flour already dried up, the mechaber is going to agree that sifting the flour is not efficacious. So the mechaber is going to agree with the Rosh and not go with the rekeach in the case where it dried up. But if it didn't dry up, if it's still damp, and it's impossible for you to do the mechaber's first eitzah, then the mechaber gives you this second eitzah of sifting the flour. Now let's go into the Mishnah Berurah. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah ice cut and test. Naflu mayim. We're talking about a case here where water fell onto the flour. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu b'Pesach gufa. We could use these eitzahs even if this happened on Pesach. On Pesach, you have flour and a little water fell on it. You could use these eitzahs that the mechaber gives even on Pesach. Ice cut and yud, aynus lach hasak. Or you have a case where the sack became moistened. The sack got wet. Mimayim, it got wet from water. According to the more chumradic opinion that we had in Siv Gimel, we had a difference of opinions in Siv Gimel. What happens when the sack gets wet from the zayah, from the sweat of a stone wall or a wooden wall? So we had a chumradic opinion, a stringent opinion, that said that even the zayah of the chayma we treat like water. So according to that opinion, so the same thing would be true here. If the sack got wet from sitting on a wall and the wall sweated and now the sack got wet, you have to do one of these two eitzahs. The kevenchen is lach hasak. Once we see that the sack became dampened, our assumption is that if the outside of the sack in a particular area is wet or damp, then the flour inside of that area must also be wet. So the mechaber said, what do? You grab that area of the sack. The words of the mechaber were, he said over here, Yoichaz biyadai kalamokaim hamaluchlach pasak. Grab that whole area of the sack that got wet. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, you're not just grabbing the fabric of the sack. Says the Mishnah Berurah, a nice cut in Yud Aleph, hamakoim hamaluchlach, the area that's wet, im hakemach sheba makom zeh, together with the flour that's in that area of the sack. V'tzarich lecha min hakemach im hasak saviv halichluach. You have to grab to the flour together with the sack, the whole area that got wet, kifi oimid hadas, according to your estimation, ad heichon shehagia halichluach, as far into the flour, in your estimation, as far as you think the moisture penetrated into the flour, uma'at yoiser, and a little bit more than that. So what you're trying to do over here, the goal over here is to grab that whole area of the flour where you assume that's the area where the flour got wet, and you want to grab a little bit more than that. You want to go a little bit beyond that to make sure that you completely get all of the moistened flour. Ice cut in your base, kala kemach shabasak. Then you're going to go ahead and you're going to empty out the rest of the sack. So you're holding on to the flour that got wet and you're dumping out everything else for later use that you're going to use on Pesach. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'nachayin lechatchila, it would be proper lechatchila l'raked achar kach gam l'chala kemach hanisha. You removed all of the flour that you assume is dry, so you think you separated all the moistened flour, and now you poured out all of the dry flour that you could use for Pesach Tikka use. Says the Chavetz Chaim, now you should go a step further, and according to most Pirushim over here, this is a Chumrah Ba'alma. You should take it another step further, and now take all the flour that you are assuming is dry flour and sift it. So just in case there's any moistened flour over there, you'll sift out any moistened clumps. V'yesh misha kasav, and there are those that write, and he brings this down in the Sharitzion from the Chemed Moshe. V'yesh misha kasav, there are those that write, this whole discussion, this eitzah of grabbing the flour together with the sack and pouring out everything else, this is only if the part of the sack that got wet is the bottom. In other words, if you have a problem, let's say you put the sack down and you didn't realize you put the sack down on a wet area. So now the bottom of the sack became damp. Okay, so now you have this eitzah. Grab the area of the sack above the wet area, toss out everything that was on top of that, and what was on the bottom, that's what you're going to assume it got wet and is not fit for Pesach Tikka use. But the bazeh mahani takanazu, in such a case where the water penetration took place on the bottom of the sack, then this eitzah seems to be an efficacious eitzah. Because what you're going to do is, if this is your sack of flour, you have a sack over here. If this is your sack of flour and it got wet on the bottom, so you'll grab the area over the wet part, you'll choke it off, and you'll pour off everything else, and everything above the area where you choked it off, you assume that that was dry, and everything on the bottom is okay. So that logically could make sense. But what if the water got dropped onto the sack from the top? What are you going to do now? What are you going to do? You know that water, that this part over here, this part of the sack up here on top became wet because water fell on it. So what are you going to do now? What are you going to do? Even if what you would do is you would choke off beneath the area that got wet and dump out the area on top so that you think you're dumping out the area that got wet, right? That also doesn't work. You know why? Because Chavetz Chaim explains why. He says, Ulai higiu hamayim ba'omek hasak. You know, there's such a thing as gravity. So if you know that the water got in here, so it's very nice. You're going to choke it off over here. But the water goes down, and you don't know how far it went down. Maybe the water went down into the depths of the sack, which is the way of water. Gravity has a tendency to pull water down. And maybe even where the water penetrated deeper into the sack, maybe now it actually dried up. And now you have no way to tell what part of it is moistened, what part of it is wet. So these shittas over here, and again, he's bringing this down from the Chemed Moshe, don't like this idea that you're going to choke off the area that's wet, only if the area that got wet was on the bottom of the sack. So then you could reasonably say that you're removing the bottom area that got wet. But from the top, this eitzah doesn't work. Valkain, therefore, in such a circumstance, ein lahakel, we should not be lenient. Earlier we said that you should choke off the wet part and pour out the dry part, use the dry part, and we said that as a chumrah, you should sift the dry part. Now, in this case, where the water penetration took place from the top down, now you should choke off the area that got wet, you toss out the part that got wet, and the dry part you have to sift. Medina. Now it's Meikar Adin. It's not a chumrah. Now you have to sift the rest of it after the Evid. Nevertheless, after the Bekoidim Pesach, maybe if this took place, if this whole problem is before Pesach, we're not talking about Pesach itself. We're talking about something, a problem that arose before Pesach. Maybe we don't have to be machmer to the extent that if you didn't sift the flour, we should be machmer. And over here in the Sharitzian and the Chavtes, the Chavetz Chaim explains what his thinking over here is why, if it happened before Pesach, there's a good reason why we could be more lenient. He says over here, the Kevan de Tzarech Likach Saviv Ba'omed Adas Va'oid Ma'at Yoiser Mikefi Ha'omed. We already said that when you use the first eitzah of the mechaber, where you're trying to choke off the area of flour that got wet, you are working towards the goal of encapsulating in your hand the entire area of the flour that got wet and a little bit more. So right away, by doing that, whatever chash there is, that there might be more flour, the water penetration might have been further into the flour than you thought, it's a chash ba'alma. It's really just a concern. Remember, we always say that the rule of thumb is ein mechaskin on isura. We don't have a presumption of isser. We have a presumption of heter, not a presumption of isser. So it's only a chash. It's a chash ba'alma. And in this case, where we're talking about a chash ba'alma, after litzaref, we could combine with the fact that it's only a chash, svaras eza poiskim, the thought processes of other poskim other than the mechaber, shemegamgigim ha'ikar psaka the mechaber bazeh. They argue on the mechaber's entire psak. Lefima the karmelo the kemach hulach balach, because we learned earlier that kemach flour is considered a taruvus, a mixture of lach balach, of wet ingredients with wet ingredients. We always say there's a huge difference in halacha between a taruvus of lach balach and a taruvus of yavesh b'yavesh. A taruvus of lach balach, it's much easier to say bittul, and also we don't say chayzer v'neir. We don't say that something that was prohibited that became bottle reawakens, because in a taruvus of lach balach, the ingredients get so definitively blended that the isser is not even here anymore. Liquid, a glass of water. You put in another liquid into the water, you can't fish out the prohibited liquid. All of the liquid totally combines. Flour, according to most poskim, is lach balach, because flour, even though physically it is dry, flour is so fine and it blends so totally that it's considered lach balach. So we're talking here about before Pesach. Before Pesach, you had an area of the flour that got wet. What are you worried about now? What's the Cheben Moshe worried about? The Cheben Moshe is worried the flour got wet from the top. You choked off the area that you think got wet. You disposed of it. But maybe the water penetrated a little further, a little deeper into the flour than you knew about, and there might be some moistened flour inside that you didn't get. This happened before Pesach. Before Pesach, chametz is mutter. Chametz is not usher. Now it's bottle before Pesach. It's definitely bottle with shishim. You definitely have shishim connected over here. So it's bottle. So you're worried that it's going to be chayzer v'neir on Pesach? It's lach balach. Lach balach is not chayzer v'neir. So the Chavetz Chaim is saying over here, you could be mitzarif. You could combine these two svaras lahakal. On the one hand, this is only a shasha ba'alma, because you did choke off all the flour that you think got wet, and you did dispose of it. Now you have a chash. Maybe there's some more. No, if there's some more, it happened before Pesach. It was bottled before Pesach. Chayzer v'neir. We're not going to say it's chayzer v'neir on Pesach because it's taruvus of lach balach. Okay. Now we go back into the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go to Ois Katan Yud Gimel. So the first eitzah that the Mechaber gave us was choke off the part of the flour that got wet, pour off the dry flour, use the dry flour, dispose of the wet flour. Then the Mechaber said, "Ve'emi efshar lasos came." If you can't do that, explains the Mishnah Berurah, like I read to you from the Be'er Heitev. Kegayin sheneslach lach mitzidai b'harbe mekaymos. For instance, if the sack became moistened in a bunch of different areas all around it, or there's a large area of the sack that got wet that you can't encapsulate it in your hand. Or maybe after the sack got wet, you moved the sack around. And he says over here, zarku, you threw it. You know why he says you threw it? Because that's the way you transport sacks of flour. I've been in the warehouse when they have to send the deliveries of the sacks of flour out. And what they do, they have 100-pound sacks of flour on pallets, and they have forklifts forking them over into the trailers. But sometimes you have a partial pallet. Sometimes you have to throw on. I see my battery is running low there. Just bear with me while I plug my laptop in. Sometimes you have to throw on another 10 bags, so you don't have a whole pallet full. So what do? They take them and they make a human chain and they throw them. That's what you do. You throw them from one to the other. Now, if you throw the sacks of flour after they got wet, bear with me. Where is that opening? There it is. Okay. All right. Laptop plugged in. Crisis averted. All right. If you throw the sacks around after they got wet, so now what are you going to do? You're going to say that you're choking it off, the moistened area with your hand? The whole sack got mixed up. So the sack is wet over here, right? So you want to grab the flour that's over there. All the flour inside the sack has gotten mixed up. That's not going to accomplish anything. So therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says that's another possible reason, another case of where the Mechaber is telling you it's I'af Shalases came. If it's not possible to use this eitzah of choking off the wet area of the flour, then you have the second eitzah of sifting it. Shezarku asak mimakom l'makom, they toss the sack around from one place to the other. And minastam, the assumption is that the flour inside the sack got mixed up. So then the Mechaber gave us the other eitzah. He said, Yiraket akemach, sift the flour, va'ashar mutter. Ice cut in your dalid, and the rest of the flour is then rendered permissible. How does the sifting work? Because in the area where the flour got moistened, yistabek hakemach, over there the flour will stick, it will clump. V'yeh k'may isa, you'll have tiny little clumps of dough where it got wet. V'yishar l'mayla b'napa, and that will stay above in the sieve when you sift the flour. V'hakemach she'over derech nikveh anapa, but the flour that passes through the holes of the sieve, certainly water didn't touch those. Otherwise, it would form clumps that wouldn't fit through the sieve. Now, v'imu b'yomtiv. Let's say you're doing this on Yom Tov. Remember, we've mentioned already several times that it was their custom to actually knead dough for matzah on Pesach. So let's say you're doing this on Pesach, and you have this problem on Pesach where you have a sack of flour that got wet. Well, on Yom Tov, you have a new problem here. You can't go ahead and sift your flour on Yom Tov. Now let's remember, Yom Tov in reality is like Shabbos. Malacha is asur on Yom Tov, the same way Malacha is asur on Shabbos. The exception to the rule is Eichel Nefesh. Malachas like cooking, making a fire. Those malachas that you need for Eichel Nefesh, you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. However, not every malacha that is involved in food preparation is mutter on Yom Tov. For example, sifting flour. That's something that very easily could be done before Yom Tov. That's not mutter on Yom Tov. There are cases where sifting flour is mutter on Yom Tov. If you sifted your flour before Yom Tov, and now on Yom Tov, for some reason, you have to do a second sifting, that could be mutter. But that's only mutter kifi hatzorich, only what you need for Yom Tov. You can't go ahead and sift now a sack of flour. So the Mishnah Berurah says, "V'emu b'yomtiv sh'asa l'rakid kemach yoyse mikafiyat tzorich yeraktenu al yedei akum." Then you should give it to a non-Jew, and you should ask a non-Jew to sift it kedei leva'er hachametz. And now, by the non-Jew sifting out the chametz, the non-Jew will get those clumps of dough, and now you're going to do beer chametz. The non-Jew will separate the chametz, and you're going to have to do beer chametz on that chametz. Remember, that's flour that got wet, and it probably sat for more than 18 minutes. It became chametz. Now it's on Pesach. You have to do beer on that chametz. It belongs to you. When we're talking about a non-Jew, you're asking the non-Jew to sift it for you, but you're not giving it to the non-Jew. Even if you wanted to give it to the non-Jew, you can't. Because remember what we always said about chametz on Pesach. Chametz on Pesach really doesn't belong to you. Why doesn't it belong to you? Because the Torah Kedosha said that chametz on Pesach is aser ba'ana. If you have something that you cannot derive any benefit from, it's not yours. So chametz technically on Pesach is not in your rishus. However, the Torah Kedosha said that chametz is in your rishus on Pesach in the context of bal yerah, bal yematzeh. You will be over the Issa Daraisa of owning chametz, of having chametz in your possession on Pesach. That ownership you have, but you can't gift it to the guy. So what do you have to do? You have your sack of flour. It has clumps of dough in it that became chametz. Give it to the non-Jew. The non-Jew will sift out the non-chametz. Now you're going to have to do bir chametz on that chametz. How are you going to do bir chametz? So if you take a look at the Sharitzion, Ice Cotton Lamed Beis, Mizbar al Yedei Shazar Kelechutz V'Nidras Paraglayim, it'll get thrown outside and it'll get stepped on. That's how you're going to do beer on it. Okay, let's see weiter. V'im naflu amayim bi Yom Tov. Now let's say you have a sack of flour and water fell on it on Yom Tov. So it's not that you went downstairs to the basement and you pulled up a sack of flour on Yom Tov and you see that it's damp. No, you had a sack, so and it might have been damp already from a week ago, so it might actually have chametz gomer in it. That's not this case. The case that we're talking about now is you have a sack of flour and water just fell on it on Yom Tov. So now what do you do? V'im naflu amayim bi Yom Tov. V'lo yishalu amayim b'kemach adayin shir mil. And that water was not sitting on the flour or on the sack for 18 minutes, so it didn't yet become chametz. Oh, yakalite l'nakri b'matana. Now you could very quickly take that sack of flour and give it to a non-Jew as a gift because it's not chametz. Kevin Shalom is chametz adayin. It didn't become chametz yet. It didn't have 18 minutes to become chametz. So now, but it's on the verge of becoming chametz. So now quickly give it to a non-Jew. It's still in your possession. It's not chametz. So now quickly give it to a non-Jew. By the time it becomes chametz, it'll belong to the non-Jew, and now you have no problem. Okay, now we go back up to the Shulchan Aruch. Let's go weiter in the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, by me, it's the second to last word on the second line. V'dafka kol zman shehu meluchlach. This second eitzah of the Mechaber, where the Mechaber said, what you could do is you could sift the flour to sift out the parts that got wet, because those areas will form clumps. That only works as long as it's still wet. Avalim nisyave shalach luchis. But if the sack got wet and now it already dried up and all the moisture is gone, loimahani rikud. Now sifting will not be efficacious. The mifrach, because the clumps, once they dry up, they will break up. Umis arev im hashar, and they'll mix together with the rest of the flour, and now you can't sift it out. Va'aser la'achloi bepesach. And now this sack of flour would be aser, would be prohibited to eat on Pesach. Ela yiragdenu. Rather, what you're going to have to do is sift it. You do have to sift it because you have to sift out. You definitely have a strong chash of chametz on this sack, and it's on Pesach. So if there's any chametz, you got to get rid of it. So sift it and remove whatever you could remove. V'yishmerenu ad achar Pesach, and put it away, the rest of the sack, until after Pesach, and use it after Pesach. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ice Cotton Tezvav. Loi mahani rikud. Once the moisture dried up, once the sack or the flour dried up already, sifting doesn't work. Now, here's an interesting one. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Vafilu kaidem Pesach. Even if it got wet and dried up before Pesach, and now you want to use it on Pesach, you can't use it through sifting. Now, the question over here right away is going to come up, why not? If there was chametz in there before Pesach, it should be bottled. Because like we just spoke about before, the flour is considered lach balach. It's considered a taruvus of wet ingredients with wet ingredients, like we explained earlier, even though it's technically dry. So it was bottled before Pesach, and now on Pesach, we should say it's not chayzer v'neir. The prohibition does not reawaken. Once the chametz portion of the mixture was bottled, it remains bottled for the duration. So why are we saying now that even if this happened before Pesach, you can't use it on Pesach? We'll explain soon. The first thing the Achronim point out over here is that when the Mechaber says that this Eitzah does not work if the flour already dried out or the sack already dried out, that's only the second Eitzah. The Eitzah of sifting the flour no longer works because once it dried out, you can't sift out the areas that got wet. But the Mechaber's first Eitzah, but the first Eitzah of the Mechaber of how to salvage the rest of the flour, to grab the area that got wet and isolate it and pour out everything else and keep everything else for Pesach Tika use, as long as you didn't throw the sack around, so you know that you could isolate the part of the flour that got wet, shaper bahani. That works even after it dried out. What's the difference? I know where the sack got wet, so as long as I know where the sack got wet, I have the ability to isolate that part of the flour, right? I know that the sack is my trusty sack. I know my sack got wet over here, so as long as I didn't throw the sack around and mix up the flour, even if it already dried out, so what? The flour that got wet is still in that area. I'll grab it, isolate it, pour out everything else. That works even after it dried out. He'll isolate that area, and the rest is permissible. But like we said earlier, you should still sift the flour afterwards. The reason you can't sift it is because once it dries out, the mifrach, whatever clumps formed while it was wet, will break up. What the Mechaber wants to say is, leperurim dakim, the area that got wet and formed a clump, once it dries up, it will break up again into tiny little crumbs. It might not break up back into fine flour like it was originally, but it will break up into small crumbs that are small enough to fall through the sieve. And it will fall through the holes of the sieve and get mixed into the rest of the flour. And now he explains why we don't say bittul. Even though you would think that we should say you have shishim, you have 60 times of the permissible flour against the problematic area that got wet, and before Pesach, chametz is batel b'shishim. It's only on Pesach that chametz isn't batel. So why don't we say that it was batel before Pesach, and it shouldn't be chayzer v'neir because it's lach balach? Nevertheless, the Chavetz Chaim says, Kishiyagiu yemei Pesach she'asurin b'mashu. Once Pesach begins, when chametz is asur b'mashu, yeh chayzer v'neir. It is going to be chayzer v'neir. V'af agav de balach balach lo yamrinon chayzer v'neir u'gedalayel simen tov ben zayin siv dalet. And even though, like I explained, by a taruvas of lach balach, we do not say chayzer v'neir. The kemach b'kemach hu lach balach. And a mixture of flour together with other flour is considered, according to most, a taruvas of lach balach because it blends so totally that it's considered like a mixture of wet ingredients. Yesh loymar, the Chavetz Chaim says we could say the pirurim einam mizbailulim heitav bekemach uba'ape nafshayu kayomin. Yes, normally flour is considered a taruvas of lach balach, because the grains of flour are so fine and flour blends so totally, we look at it as a taruvas of lach balach, but not once it gets wet. Once it gets wet and now moistened clumps form, even if those clumps end up drying up and breaking up a little bit into crumbs, they're still markedly more coarse than the rest of the flour. And therefore it will not blend totally, and therefore it does not have the status of lach balach, and it will be chayzer v'neir. Yesh laimar de pirurim einam mizbailulim hetiv. The crumbs will not mix well b'kemach with the rest of the flour, u'ba'ape nafshayu kaimen, and they stand separate from the rest of the mixture. It's even possible that when you now take this flour with these crumbs of moistened flour in it and you knead it into a dough, those areas of the moistened flour will still not break apart totally and mix with the rest. And on Pesach there will be chayzer the neya, even after it's baked. Okay, we're going to stop over here at Sif Katan Yud Zayin. Thank you so much for joining me for this Torah learning. The schus of Limud Torah should be Megan Agans Klal Yisrael. Anyone who needs Yeshuas and Refuas, the Rebbe Shalom should send Refuah Shalema to all those. Our Chaylim should protect everybody who has not gotten ill. They shouldn't get ill. Everybody should be well. Those who need Parnasa, the Rebbe Shalom should send bracha in Parnasa. Everybody should have everything that they need. And the Rebbe Shalom should send the Geula Shlema. We should all be zeichet to come to the Beis Hamikdash. We should be Mekabel the Torah in Yerushalayim, Yitzhak. Be well.